Hello, this is Vicky. I can hear myself as well.
Yes, Vicky, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Is it clear?
Now we can hear you, but not too well.
Vicky, can you hear us? Vicky, can you hear us?
So, hello everybody. We're going to start the webinar very shortly, in a minute or so. And Vicky, the co-facilitator of the biennial assessment and overview of climate finance flows of the Standing Committee, will kickstart the meeting with a few remarks. Later, she will be joined by Cindy Nafo, the other co-facilitator. There will be a presentation on the key findings of the biennial assessment. That will include several findings from the overview section, which Vicky will cover, followed by key findings on the assessment part of the biennial assessment. That will be covered by Charlene Watson from the ODI. After that, there will be opportunity for questions and answers and discussions. With that, Vicky, are you with us?
Yes,
I can.
So, Senia might be able to join us later. Would you want to kickstart already?
Sure, but I can hear myself.
So there is a little bit of a echoing coming from either your end or another colleague who has joined via phone.
Okay.
We would kindly ask everybody to mute while Vicky kickstarts the webinar.
Okay. So yeah, I think, yes, it works now. Thank you very much for doing that. So we can go to the first slide. Thank you. So I don't know if this slide actually needs still an introduction. I mean, it's a well-known diagram which we call the onion diagram, and this basically shows the overview of climate finance flows in the period 2015-2016. So what you can see here is that it shows the different flows that form part of the global total climate finance, both public and private, international and domestic, as well as the flows from developed to developing countries. So it's important to know that this is a total overview of climate finance, so not just the flows from developed to developing countries. And the color is just is to show the level of completeness of the information, which you can see on the left of the onion diagram. So you have the level of completeness. Yeah, basically, the more complete, the darker the color. So yeah. So, but if we go to the next slide, there you can actually have the breakdown of the underlying numbers of the onion diagram, broken down by type of flow, sector, and channel. And I think on a comparable basis, the global climate flows increased by 17% in 2015-16 compared to 2013-2014. With regards to the flows from Annex 2 parties to non-Annex 1 parties, climate-specific flows reported in the third biennial reports submitted by the Annex 2 parties has increased by 24% in 2015. So that's on a year-on-year basis, amounting to a total of $33 billion, and and then by 14% in 2016, which amounted to $38 billion. So also important to see is that the total amount channeled through the UNFCCC funds, which includes the JEF, the GCF, the LDCF, the SCCF, and so on, and also the other multilateral climate funds in 2015 and 16 were about 1.4 billion and 2.4 billion in respective 2015-16, which actually which means a significant increase, which has much to do with the ramping up of the Green Climate Fund operations. Then by the climate finance by the MDBs to eligible recipient countries from their own resources was reported as to $23.4 billion in 2015 and $25.5 billion in 2016. Then another point of information is that the methodology in the 2018 biennial assessment used the attribution of the NDB finance flows to members of the OECD DAC minus the Republic of Korea. And this calculated up to 17.4 billion in 2015 and $19.7 billion in 2016 to OECD DAC ODA eligible recipients. And for project level data, the Climate Policy Initiative, the CPI, has estimated renewable energy flows for new projects to range from $2.4 billion in 2015 and 1.5 in 2016. But this was a bit of it was actually like significant underestimation given the underlying reporting approaches. I mean, basically the methodology dictates what is actually being estimated, of course. So that's an important message to give as well. And then for private finance mobilization, what was reported by the MDBs was 10.9 billion in 2015, which is a 43% increase following the year to 15.7 billion. The OECD has also made estimates around this, and this calculated into 21.7 billion in climate-related private finance mobilized during 2012-2015 by the bilateral and multilateral institutions. So just to give you that, the biennial assessment also gives some insights on the recipients of climate finance. These are, for example, that for 2015 and 2016, national and local governments received 50% and 60% of the bilateral climate finance provided to the OECD DAC. So it goes then to the governments directly. From the total climate finance committed by the MDBs from their own resources, 72% in 2015 and 74% which in 2016 were channeled to public sector recipients. But again, due to a lack of data and incomplete reporting, we pose a challenge in identifying recipient institutions. So there is still some work ahead of that issue. So I know it's a lot of numbers and a lot of data, but I think this is important as our key findings, at least on the overview of finance flows. But I think we can go to the assessment now. Thank you. So to the next speaker.
Thanks, Vicky. If we can move on to the next slide, I'm happy to present to you some of the high-level messages emerging from the assessment chapter. So this third chapter of the biennial assessment explores the different insights into effectiveness of access to and ownership of climate finance from developed to developing countries. And it also provides insights into impact reporting practices. So the channel itself focusing just on a subset of the different channels of public climate finance, so a subset of those that have been mentioned by Vicky already. So the channels, the multilateral climate change funds, bilateral development finance, and MDB finance, these are all flows that play a critical role in helping countries deliver on their NDCs and answer or provide insights into crucial questions of interest in the context of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. It's also worth noting that these are the most transparent and complete with respect to data availability, which is another reason why it's possible to go into such analysis in detail. So the table at the top of the slide illustrates the key features of this subset of climate finance. And it's worth noting ourselves that these channels have increased since the 2016 BA, as Vicky has mentioned. You can see that when you consider these flows in aggregate, the support for mitigation does remain greater than the support for adaptation across all of these sources at face value, and recognises some differences in methodologies. Bilateral finance had the greatest proportion intended for adaptation, up at 29%, followed by multilateral climate change funds at 25%, and then the MDBs just over 20%. The BA finds an increase in public climate finance flows that contribute towards adaptation and mitigation. We see that there's this increase in what's called cross-cutting, or what's coded there as cross-cutting climate finance, makes it more difficult to track the progress made in ramping up adaptation finance, though it reflects this integrated reality of climate change action and our desires to mainstream climate change issues. Grants continue to be a key instrument for the provision of adaptation finance. If you look at the boxes on the right-hand side, in the period 2015-2016, grants accounted for 62 and 94% of the face value of bilateral adaptation finance reported to OECD and adaptation finance from the multilateral climate change funds, respectively. In the same period, 9% of adaptation finance thrown through the MDBs was grant-based. The figures aren't presented on that slide, but mitigation finance remains less concessional in nature. So 25% of bilateral, 31% of multilateral climate change funding, and 4% of MDB investments take the form of grants for mitigation. It's worth noting that these kind of analyses don't capture the added value that can be brought by combining different types of financial instruments within a single project, or technical assistance with capital flows. And then finally on this slide, with respect to the geographic distribution, Asia collectively, so as a large group, remains the principal recipient of these public climate finance flows, followed by Latin America and the Caribbean, and then Sub-Saharan Africa. For the first time, the 2018 BA also looked to try to distinguish the funding going to CIDS and LDCs, where it's seen that the type of support is significantly more focused on adaptation than mitigation in LDCs and CIDS. If we move on to the next slide, we can see that ownership remains a critical factor in the delivery of effective climate finance. While it's quite a broad concept, it encompasses the consistency of climate finance with national priorities, the degree to which national systems are used, and the engagement of a wide range of stakeholders. So the chapter reviews a large number of efforts that have been put in place to build capacity to access and make strategic choices about how to use finance and oversee its implementation. There's been a greater commitment seen by ministries of finance and planning, though it's still recognised that climate finance is not often fully integrated into national budgetary planning. We see a lot of national level institutions in beneficiary countries playing a greater role in managing climate finance and there's some key case studies through domestic tracking systems in that chapter. And NDCs, for which further financial resources need to be found, are emerging as somewhat of a platform that governments can use to stimulate engagement and strengthen the national ownership of climate finance, although that is, of course, a work in progress. Developing country institutions are increasingly able to meet fiduciary environmental social safeguard requirements to access multilateral climate change funds. We see that thanks to the often significant investments that they have made in enhancing processes and institutional capacities, there's a notable increase in the number of regional and national implementing entities to the climate change funds. This is in particular over the past 5 years as a result of the establishment, authorization, and accreditation of entities working with the Green Climate Fund. However, it's worth noting that the entities across the 5 UNFCCC funds has multiplied. So between the 2016 and the 2018 BA, the Green Climate Fund increased its number of accredited entities by 91%. And national institutions make up more than half of its accredited implementing entities. It's worth noting that information was correct at the beginning of 2018, and things have changed since then. It's worth also noting that while we see the increase in national and regional accredited entities, the actual flow of funds is slightly lagging behind. So we need to see more finance flowing through these regional entities. Mechanisms for monitoring the impact of climate finance are slowly improving, although not necessarily uniformly. Reduction of greenhouse gas emissions remains the primary impact metric for mitigation, and the chapter itself goes into more detail about what's expected and what has been delivered to date, or at least reported to be delivered to date through the multilateral climate change funds. The impact of adaptation continues to be focused on the number and type of people that are beneficiaries of these funds, although the nature and extent of the beneficial effect is still very difficult to quantify, be it directly or indirectly. On the next slide, the 2018 BA was the first to consider Article 2.1c, and that's the consistency of all financial flows with the Paris Agreement. The graphic shows that climate finance continues to account for a small proportion of overall finance flows, and the level of finance is below that one would expect in view of the investment opportunities and the needs that have been
Un appel
identified.
que gehaald. Goed enorm geduld van ons geliefd. Votre appel est en attente. Merci de patienter. Ihr Anruf wird gehalten. Bitte warten Sie. Your call is on hold. Please wait.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption. I don't know who that was. I hope you can all still hear me. So I was just saying that clear momentum, the 2018 BA looks across the chapters of progress towards Article 2.1c, or at least the variety of actions that are being taken that might be considered progress towards Article 2.1c. And you see the momentum towards strengthening the global response to the threat of climate change in financial systems and in broader financial flows is happening. So, for example, there is recent growth in regulation and policy, which supports change through the force of law, such as action by central banks, financial regulatory authorities, employing various instruments to make flows consistent with the Paris Agreement. We also see progress with respect to economic instruments, fiscal instruments, for example, supporting climate change through price signals. Many countries are making commitments or are taking action to reorganize public subsidies that facilitate higher greenhouse gas emissions, such as fossil fuel or land use subsidies, though it's very recognized that these often support other development and social goals, so need very careful reform if reform is to be undertaken. And information instruments as well, these influence behavior through awareness. The Financial Stability Board Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures has really gone a long way in supporting the understanding that climate change poses a real risk to financial stability. And there are many more coalitions, transparency initiatives, certification schemes, etc. that exist that support this objective. The Biennial assessment also recognises that there's a long way to go to build consensus between actors, between which actions, methods and metrics will be appropriate to be considered in the pursuit of Article 2.1c. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Charlene. I think we can thank you very much for that explanation, and that we can go to the next slide on the recommendations. I mean, yes, I think for this, as of this webinar, I would like to have, because I want to put more time on the questions and answers than I'm explaining the recommendations themselves. But I think it's good that we still recall what was actually decided as coming out of this. So first, the first recommendation was about ensuring that while we have more progress made on the reporting, that we continue to enhance the transparency. And I think the MPGs, the modalities, procedures and guidelines coming out of Katowice decisions are already first steps there. But very important now will be to make sure that the common tablet formats are also delivering what's necessary to ensure this enhanced transparency, consistency and comparability of data. So yeah, I'm just going to go through this and say my views on it, but I really like to hear your views as well, of course. So encourage parties to provide climate finance and enhance their reporting of climate finance. Then also through this harmonization of effect, that was very clear from SCF point of view that we need to have the parties on board in their different memberships of those boards that actually decide on the methodologies that are being used, to see if there are already steps made there. And then the fourth one on this page is about to also encourage the developing country parties to enhance their reporting. And just as with the first recommendation, I think the MPGs made a huge effort on that regard, and that now we need to see this translated in the common tablet formats to be made by end of 2020. Next slide, please. Yeah, we got a lot of recommendations made. Then also about this from the all sources. I mean, I think Charlene already mentioned the combination of financial instruments, how important this is, but that also ensures that we need to have a better reporting system in place from all sources. Then, of course, the report information climate finance provided that, I mean, this is really an exchange of reports that needs to be enhanced, and as well as having the private finance providers and so on to be included. Yeah, I always feel bad just reading out what's in the text, but so the private sector associations and financial institutions, there we need to further enhance and engage with the SCF, because that's one of the things that I hope that by the 2020 biennial assessment we get a better quality for the BA. Also recognizing that a lot of efforts are being made in this regard. And then at least we have one request for the SCF to continue its work in the mapping of available data sets that integrate climate change considerations into insurance, lending, and investment making, decision-making processes. Which is a very important matter relating to Article 2, Paragraph 1C about making financial flows consistent with the low greenhouse gas path and climate resilient development. Okay, so next slide. Yes, the complementarity between climate finance and sustainable development is an important matter. And also, which I think was also already a bit more in the 2016 BA, which was about making sure that available resources through the operating entities of the financial mechanism are being used. Can you still hear me?
We do hear you, even though there was an interruption.
Yes, okay. Sorry, I got nice music in the meantime. So yeah, just to wrap up the recommendations at least, is that we also mentioned to encourage developed countries and climate finance providers to continue to enhance the country ownership and consider policies to balance funding for adaptation and mitigation, take into account beneficiary country strategies. And finally, to encourage climate finance to improve the tracking and reporting on gender-related aspects of climate finance impact measuring and mainstreaming. Yeah, next slide. So the MDBs and the multilateral climate funds, as well as other financial institutions, are requested to continue to advance work on the tracking and reporting on impacts of mitigation and adaptation finance. And then we also request the UN agencies to provide information to parties through the secretariat on how their development assistance and climate finance programs incorporate climate proofing and climate resilience measures. I think this is also in relation with having this consistency between climate finance and sustainable development. Also, in the 2020 biennial assessment, we should continue assessing the information about the alignment of climate finance with investment needs and plans related to the parties' NDCs and national adaptation plans, which is, of course, related to the country ownership, and also take into consideration available information relevant to Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. Yeah, next slide. Okay, so yeah, I think I went quite quick through the different recommendations, but it is really to hear your view, what you considered what was the usefulness of the 2018 BA, and how those recommendations should be further developed. So I really would prefer to open the floor and see what other people think. Thank you. Or is Saini on board, then of course he can also bring in his point of view. Any demands, asks for the floor?
Well, I have a couple of comments I could make. This is Nancy Sage from the EIB. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm just hoping you can.
Yes.
Okay, so I think EBRD is not on the call, and they are our climate finance report coordinators. But therefore, I'm going to report on something which I think is relevant for this discussion. We have had an interesting discussion over the last few years about which countries should be included in the MDB report, because the report covers at the moment developing countries and emerging economies. And of course, there are many different ways, many different lists out there of what list of countries you might expect to put in. And therefore, even in different reporting like the biennial assessment or OECD or other reporting, there are different lists of countries that are needed for different reasons. So what we are planning to do, we did give some very granular country level information last year. You may have seen that in the 2017 report. And in the 2018 report, which will be coming out shortly, there will be even more granular information. But I think it is important to have information about climate finance in all countries, and then anybody who is using it can take whatever they need. So if they want global climate finance, they can have developing all countries. If they want a region, they can take a region. If they want ODA country lists, they can. If they want relevant for UNFCCC negotiations, they can. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to provide this full granularity for all countries this year. So just to tell you that, so you should look out for that report, and we would be very interested to have feedback from you when you see the next one, whether this is helpful to have this information. We've also tried to highlight the income level from the sort of IMF listings. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is to say that we are indeed always working on improved harmonization, as not only the Standing Committee on Finance, but also the G20 have asked us to do. We are working, as you may have seen at the last COP, on a strengthened set of common principles, which we're working with IDFC, which will obviously also hopefully improve clarity on what we would think should be counted as mitigation. And that's important because technology is changing quite fast in some sectors. And then one thing I wanted to say on the impacts, I think it is important to have impact reporting, but I would also say that you have to be a little bit careful about it, because I've done enough greenhouse gas accounting work to know that unless you're very, very clear on the methodologies, you can almost make the estimated savings be anything you like. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. And I actually think that sometimes the impact reporting is more important in the non-climate finance. So, for example, impact reporting of estimated savings from new wind farms of greenhouse gas, this is important. But at the end of the day, we know we need more renewable energy. What we also need to look at is impacts, and this links to the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure on non-climate finance, because this is where actually you need to look very carefully, because in non-climate finance, you can have things which are kind of climate neutral. They are not necessarily big emitters, but you can also have things which are very big emitting projects or sectors. So the two are not the same. And therefore, I would just make that point for your consideration. The impact reporting, climate impact reporting, is important for all types of money flows, but also that actually the most important thing is the actual emissions. So I'm talking about absolute emissions. Sometimes people call them gross. There's a lot of reporting only of relative or savings, estimated savings. And I think that this is very important in some sectors. It gives you a comparison. but it doesn't tell you actually what is changing the climate. And then the last thing I wanted to say, which is very EIB specific thing, is just to say that I would like to make sure that everybody is aware that although we report with the MDBs our climate finance, not in all of our countries of operations, but in the countries that are covered by the MDB reporting, but our ODA finance is reported through the EU to the OECD. So it's important just to make sure there's no double count there. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anybody else who has first some comments, both on whether they on their own organization or on those recommendations or on the BA? Don't be shy. Well, then maybe let me just, well, thank you, Nancy, first for bringing in those relevant points. I think it's a very useful for our further discussion. And about this granularity of data, I think to make sure that what we report on or what is being reported is actually useful, this granularity of data is one of the issues that we all need to work on, not just the MDBs, but also individual parties and collectively, I would say. So that's, I think, a really important point, because as we all know, there are different understandings of what climate finance could be, but if we at least have a level of granularity which allows to see what is included or what is not included, that would be a useful way out of this predicament. I'm looking forward to your improved harmonization. This is, as a question back to you would be, or to other parties, MDBs present, would be, is there anything that from SCF point of view we could actually do, or from UNFCCC level that we could do to make sure that we have this call for harmonization strengthened? Is there, what can parties do to allow for this, or is it already being done by, for instance, going through the board or through G20 and so on? And then also thanks for this impacts reporting and the request to have very robust methodologies on GHG. I think, yes, that's definitely an important point. So whether you could respond to my questions, or if anybody has anything to bring, please do so.
Well, while they're thinking of a question for you, I will try and answer your two questions. There is an IFI working group on greenhouse gas accounting, and it's wider than the MDBs. It's wider than IDFC. It has some other important players. And they have been working for a few years, and now the UNFCCC, which is another part from the SCF part, is supporting them in a secretarial way. I think it is important, but I think that transparency, as you said, on the finance is also really important in the greenhouse gas reporting. I think the most important thing you can do is require that anybody that is quoting any kind of impact is telling you two very important things. One, what methodology did they use, including what baseline are they comparing to when they are giving you a relative figure. I would think that anybody should be insisting on absolute figures. Anybody who knows me knows I've been banging on about this for a long time. But if you don't look at that in the eye, what are the actual emissions from the project? You can have, you also need relative, the estimated savings, but you need both. So I think it's really important to be very transparent about the methodology and the baseline. And the other really important thing is to know whether the reporting is prorated to the finance, or is it for the whole activity? So for me, coming from a project-based organization, we have obviously greenhouse gas figures for, say, the whole project, but we also co-finance with other IFIs, with governments, with climate funding, and it's really important that it's transparently reported whether the figures given are for the whole project or activity, or are they prorated to the finance of the person who's reporting. So that's one thing I think you could do. And on the further harmonization, oh sorry, what was your second question? I know you mentioned harmonization. There was another specific question though you had.
To know if there was anything that, I mean, like for now in the SCF recommendations, we urge those governments who are board members, and if there is anything else that from UNFCCC or SCF we could do to strengthen this harmonization. Like,
yes. I think there is one thing you could do. In the report that was done, I think in 2014, oh, no, it was 2015. But anyway, it was done looking at how the progress towards the 100 billion. And there was an annex in there showing the coefficients that are used for Rio markers. I think it's very important that the methodology is quoted when climate finance is being quoted. So it's important that MDBs do use their methodology, which we do, and we publish the methodology so people can see it and use it. But I would say it's also important that you ask other people. Then you can see, is this very similar to the MDB approach or different? But particularly, for example, for Rio markers, that annex showed that the coefficients that are used for Rio marker 1 and 2 can be very different. And I think you could be asking, I mean, sometimes I see a lot of times people saying they are using a Rio marker approach, but if you do not know what coefficients are being used, you don't actually know what they're counting. So again, I would just say that is something that you could follow up, I think, because you can get very, very big differences, particularly on adaptation. And I think it's very important that any reporting, any IFI and any country is clear what coefficient they're using. If they're using a Rio marker approach, or if they're using another approach for climate finance, what is it they're using? So I think that's something you could be pushing. So rather than impose a particular methodology, first step is to have real transparency on what methodology are people using.
Thank you. Very clear message. Anybody else who wants to ask questions or comments? Yes. Then perhaps allow me to ask a question to Charlene, because one of the things are we looking into the next biennial assessment. I was wondering, is there an opportunity that we could go into even further sectoral, also granularity of data? So, for instance, I receive a lot of questions about how not just how much went to mitigation or adaptation, but also under those different categories. There was a mention of renewable energy, but there is also the factor of agriculture, sustainable forest management, and so on. Is there an opportunity to do this, or is that again something that we're struggling with the available methodologies or available data?
Thanks a lot, Vicky. So with respect to the particular flows that are looked at in the assessment chapter, so if we take them one by one, the multilateral climate change funds, there are few enough projects that you could try to code those. So for example, the climate funds update does try to align them with OECD sectors, and that then links up to the bilateral OECD data, which is again could potentially be lined up with OECD sectors. But the OECD database and the Rio marker tagging is not really designed to add up climate change finance. It's much more designed for kind of mainstreaming of climate finance. And the sectors and the sectoral classifications we see there aren't necessarily the ones you would have chosen if you were trying to look at which sectors climate finance is flowing to. So there's that. And then when you go on to the MDBs use a different sectoral classification, and there isn't the same level of granularity in the detail. So it's actually quite hard to kind of extract and align all of the figures. So I'm sure that, it's worth taking on board this comment and trying to think in more detail to what degree we can get at different sectors in the data. But I think what we would have to do is to start with a kind of a data source by data source understanding of sectors, and then try and work up in consultation with the different providers from there which of these sectors we could kind of try to group together or categorize. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to open the floor one more time to see if anybody wants to bring in other points. If not, I'm sure that you have other important matters to go to, but still, anybody who wants to bring in something? I can hear people in the background, but I don't think they're talking to me, so it's...
I'm sorry to be very boring, but this is Nancy from the EIVB again, if nobody else has a question. I wanted to mention Paris alignment, as you mentioned it, but I think it's worth highlighting. So this is about all finance rather than climate finance, although obviously climate finance is a very important part of it. And I do think that it's a really big step that you're planning to do in the next biennial assessment, to be looking at that, and I think it's really, really important. It's mainstream, but it's more focused mainstreaming in a way. And we are, as you know, working on that as a group of MDBs quite intensively since we announced our framework at the last COP. And we are planning to obviously explain at one of the Bonn meetings what we're doing, but we're also planning to have a dialoguing meeting around the meetings in Bonn in June, hopefully with other people that are also working on this. We are talking with IDFC, and I think I saw that Sophie Bartosz is in this call. We are also looking and liaising with various research organizations that have also been studying Paris alignment. So again, all I would say is when we've worked out the logistics and worked out what would be a good date, please look out for that event, which we hope will bring together yourselves, but also other people interested in talking about what Article 2.1c means, because it's very important, not just for MDBs, but for many other parts of the financial industry.
Thank you, and thank you for raising this important 2.1c. Of course, is a very important step for our next BA as well. If you have concrete information about this event, I'm sure that the Secretariat would love to get this so that they can distribute it if they wish to do so. So that's actually, we have very soon a meeting, a conference call between the SCF members about the 2020 biennial assessment. And still, I'm still stealing some of your time to know if people have some. Well, you can bring in your own recommendations on the 2020 biennial assessment to see what we should be looking out for in that new report. And then I'll let you go. Okay, so I think we're doing well as there are no further recommendations, and of course we have luckily very capable SCF team. Not bragging about myself, but just about everybody else in the SCF. So thank you very much for participating at this webinar. I hope you found it interesting, and that because what our main purpose was to make sure that what we did, the biennial assessment, is a big piece of work. And we really want to thank the consultants working on this, that it's actually not just being lost. I mean, this is an important step and should actually allow for more discussion time and more questions and answers around it. So thank you for participating. And if there are no further comments, I would actually make sure that we can go through the rest of the other day. So thank you.
Vicky, maybe one
Secretary.
last thing. Sorry.
Mhm.
This is Sophie from German Watch. I know you gave us a lot of time to raise questions, but I just wanted to verify, you said there will be a call on the next biennial assessment. When will that call be? So perhaps if people do have suggestions, what would be needed? Yeah, so we could perhaps still provide input.
This call will actually be very soon, but it will only be amongst SCF members to discuss the outline. But if you have suggestions, this is why I was opening the floor now, that you could bring them in at this point. But the purpose of the call is to agree on the outline of the next biennial assessment. So basically on the table of content.
Yeah. No, so I do not, but it was just to know whether it would be possible, for example, to send you anything if we had something in advance. I understand it's a call between SCF, but if it's not possible, then that's well understood.
You call me bilaterally, we can talk about it.
All right.
If you're not ready now. I mean, it's not, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Thanks.
Okay, so I think the people are interested in the next biennium as well. Thank you very much. Give the floor back to the secretary to wrap up, if that's okay. Thank you.
So thank you, Vicky, thank you, Charlene, and everybody on the call. So before closing this webinar, just a couple of announcements. The Standing Committee on Finance will hold a side event on the sidelines of the June session. More precisely on the Saturday 22nd during the lunch break. The venue to be launched, to be announced, so everybody can participate there. It's an open event. The side event will not be dedicated to the biennial assessment, but rather will be an opportunity to receive an update on the ongoing work of the Standing Committee in the context of the work plan. Biennial assessment is one of them, but it's a good opportunity to engage with the Standing Committee. And secondly, there will be in the future, in the same way it's been in the past, there will be the possibility of responding to calls for evidence the Standing Committee might issue in the course of the preparation of the 2020 BA. This is usually in the form of a call for evidence that outlines areas for information where information gaps exist, whether it's in form of the data, sectorial or thematic or otherwise, or with respect to more qualitative information on the financial flows, but also on the non-climate finance flows. That call for evidence might be issued even when the Standing Committee agrees to it, either the fourth quarter of this year or the first quarter of the next year. So with those two updates, we've arrived at the end of the webinar. If there are no further queries, we'll close here. And perhaps just very finally, the presentations, you might have received already an email by now, but the presentation that was made during the webinar will be published on the website of the Standing Committee. Again, if you haven't received that email, you'll receive it shortly with a link. So Vicky, if there are no further remarks from your side, we'll terminate here.
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you all for participating. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. The
Thank
webinar
you.
finishes here.
Thank you.
Bye.